Hello, and welcome to the podcast Justice Unbound, about women, religion, and the State of Israel. In this podcast, we take you behind the closed doors of Israeli rabbinic courts, where all hearings are held in camera, closed to the public, and where the state applies religious laws to decide the fate of women trapped in marital captivity, agunot, of children stigmatized because of their mother's sexual partners, mamzerim, of converts who did not keep the Sabbath, and where citizens are cross-examined about whether they are Jewish enough, and much, much more. Justice Unbound is written and produced by the Center for Women's Justice, CWJ. I am your host, Susan Weiss.
Hi, I'm your host, Rivkah. Today we are talking about chalitza, how Jewish women free themselves from the legal tie to their brothers-in-law, known as yibum or levirate marriage. This is a continuation of the last episode in which we described both chalitza and yibum in detail. If you haven't listened to the last episode, please go back and listen to it. It's important so that you can better understand what we will be talking about today.
Today, we want to talk about how chalitza is affecting young women in Israel at this very moment, as we speak. But first, we'll give you a quick recap of the main ideas that we spoke about last time. Last time we spoke at length about yibum. Under biblical law, a man is obligated to take the widow of his brother as his wife if his brother died without any children. The act of marrying your brother's widow is called yibum, or levirate marriage, as we already mentioned. Yibum is not practiced today in any Jewish community. Instead, what is practiced is chalitza, the ritual in which the legal tie of yibum is renounced and the parties are freed from any obligation one to the other. The widow can marry someone else, and the brother does not have to marry the widow or take her as his second wife in the event that he is already married. The ritual renunciation of chalitza is conducted in front of a quorum of 10 adult men, a minyan. The ritual requires the widow to take off her husband's brother's shoe and to spit on the floor in front of him. The spitting is a symbolic condemnation of the brother for not meeting his legal obligations to the widow. Only when the widow physically removes the brother's shoe and actually spits in real time is she set free. If the ritual is not performed for any reason or is not performed correctly, the woman is still tied by the halachic to her husband's brother by law. The rabbis cannot simply declare the tie undone. In that sense, the chalitza ritual is very much like the get ceremony. Until the husband delivers the get, the Jewish bill of divorce, to his wife, she is still married to him. And until the brother allows his brother's widow to take off his shoe and spit, she is still tied to him.
Yes, and in fact, Jewish law treats the widow as if she were a divorced woman. That means that after chalitza, she, like a divorced woman, is prohibited from marrying a kohen. Her pool of available partners is limited. If she had had children with her deceased husband, the widow could marry any eligible Jewish man, including a kohen, a member of the priestly caste.
And we need to remind our listeners that in Israel, all Jewish marriages are conducted by state officials in accordance with Jewish law. So it is the state adopting Jewish law which does not permit a widow to remarry if she has not undergone the chalitza ceremony, should it be required by Jewish law. And after the chalitza ceremony is completed, it is the state which prohibits her from marrying a kohen. And as I've said in other contexts, paraphrasing Barack Obama, love is not love in the state of Israel. If a widow who needs chalitza falls in love with a kohen, well, that's just too bad. Anyway, in this episode, we're going to talk about the very real need for chalitza that has arisen since October 7th of last year, 2023, and how we at CWJ have been responding to it. So, Rivkah, let's start with numbers. Tell us how many rituals of chalitza did the state oversee every year before the war, and how many have they had to deal with since October 7th?
Okay, so since the attack of Hamas on October 7th, and the war following it, many young Israeli women have lost their husbands in battle. I think the number is way over 300. So, in a regular year, the number of Jewish women who need chalitza in Israel is about 15 to 20. Those are the numbers that we get from the Beit Din, from their statistics. We don't really know if that number reflects the number of women who actually are in need of chalitza, in order to be able to get married under the rules of the state. This number may only be the number of women who tried to receive a license to marry and were suddenly informed by the marriage registrar that they cannot get married until they go through the ritual. We have absolutely no idea how many women just don't bother with it. Maybe they never remarry, or maybe they remarry civilly outside the state of Israel. Because of the war, at least another 15 women and maybe up to 25 more women are in need of chalitza. Remember, these are only women who married religiously and did not have children with their husband. And as you've reminded us, all Israeli Jewish women who marry in the state must marry religiously. So this affects most Jewish widows whose husbands were killed before the couple had children.
So the number that the state is dealing with us has at least doubled or perhaps tripled since the war.
Yes.
Okay, so tell us what the women's organizations are doing about this. What do they have to contribute to this matter?
So because doing chalitza has always been thought of as a traumatizing experience, remember you have to bend down, remove another person's shoe, and spit at him, and that person happens to be your dead husband's brother, a relative, and all this is in front of 10 strange men and rabbis. So the women's organizations in Israel have asked the chief rabbinate to try and make the ceremony more friendly for these young widows. Some activists have spoken to army rabbis to try and get them to understand how delicate this issue is. They've asked the rabbis to work hand in hand with the army in order to find out which women need to go through this ordeal. Then they asked the rabbis to designate someone who would talk to the widows and explain to them why they needed to go through this ritual in the first place, and to prepare the widows for the ritual itself. The chief rabbi of Israel also agreed to do the chalitza ritual in his chambers instead of in the religious courts.
The chalitza ritual is indeed quite harrowing. I've seen a number of videos on YouTube documenting the chalitza ceremony. They look quite frightening.
Yes, and anyone, by the way, can go into Google and just write chalitza, and you'll get one of these awful movies. Anyway, many of us Jewish women would actually like to do away with chalitza completely. But as Orthodox Jews, we can't really get up and say, let's drop it. So we have figured out ways to work around it. It is helpful to understand how Jewish communities have attempted to solve the issue of chalitza throughout the ages.
Rivkah, explain what you mean by solving the issue of chalitza if you don't intend to take the rule of chalitza and yibum off the books completely.
So what I mean is that communities and rabbis have tried to help young widows bypass the need of chalitza and maybe not have to do it at all, or to do it as quickly and as simply as possible. So we're talking about 4 strategies that were used to help the widows in need of chalitza. I'm actually basing myself on a doctorate written by Rabbi Dr. Ayelet Segal at the Hebrew University in the Talmud department. So one strategy involves the Beit Din, the rabbinic courts. And the other 3 strategies involve the creation of legal loopholes through types of contracts. I'll outline them. The first strategy is pressure applied by the Beit Din. I guess that doesn't really count as a strategy, but it did work in the past. The problem was solved when the Beit Din, the religious court, had power over the community, and the people abided by the judgments of the rabbis. All the Beit Din had to do is to make a clear proclamation which ordered the brother to take part in the ceremony. The brother would participate in the ceremony because the rabbis told him to do so. But that's expecting a lot today. We don't live in those kinds of close communities, and the Beit Din does not have so much influence over men. Nor, as our experience, Susan, has taught us, will the Beit Din do very much for women. It would prefer that women pay for their freedom, like the story that we talked about last week, where she was just extorted.
That was a case where the father-in-law demanded that the woman give up all her inheritance rights, correct?
Yes, and that happens all the time. I've heard rabbis say, people that work in the Beit Din and work with these cases, that these things happen all the time. Women who need chalitza have to give up all their inheritance. It's like almost automatic. The other 3 strategies are contractual in nature. The first is a legal obligation signed by the husband's brother called a shtar chalitza. The second is a conditional bill of divorce signed by the husband called a get shchiv mira. And the third is a declaration signed by the husband that sets forth specific conditions to the marriage.
In fact, Rivkah, I think it is more accurate to describe these contracts, if you will, as statements by the husband made to the public about the way that he is taking a woman into his possession.
Okay, but let's leave the feminist analysis aside for the time being and return to the three remaining strategies. So first is what's called shtar chalitza. This is an obligation that the woman's family tried to get the brother of the groom to sign before the wedding. It states that the brother will set the bride free, will undergo the chalitza ritual in an event that the husband dies before he had any children with the bride. A bill like this was very popular in Ashkenaz for many years.
Rivkah, but you'll agree with me that this shtar chalitza doesn't really solve the problem because the brother could disappear, renege on his promise, or extort the widow, and there's nothing that she can do about it.
In the shtar chalitza that the brother of the groom signs, he says that if he doesn't do chalitza, he'd have to pay her money. So it would be kind of like something civil that she could actually take to court later. So it's more than just goodwill.
I'm wondering now why no one mentioned the possibility of Yibum and Chalitza to me when I got married, Kedat Moshe Yisrael, in New York City. My husband had two brothers. If you had asked me what Yibum and Chalitza was at that time, I would not have been able to tell you. Did you know about Yibum and Chalitza when you got married? Did you have your husband's brother sign such a document, a shtar chalitza?
Yes, I was aware of the problem, but no, I didn't deal with it in any legal way. Actually, I first learned about shtar chalitza years ago when I was writing articles for Energy and Ynet. A woman who read my articles sent me a shtar chalitza that had been given to her grandmother, and they were keeping it in the family. It was quite amazing to read it. And since then, by the way, I got a couple more of shtar chalitzas that women have kept from their ancestors. In a doctorate, Dr. Ayelet Segal states that the shtar chalitza has not been used since the Second World War. It's very interesting. She suggests that this may be because people trusted the chief rabbinate of Israel to solve the matter after the creation of the state. So it's very interesting that in the past, there were all these things going on to help women, and now that there's a state of Israel and a rabbinate, then the communities stop taking responsibility, hoping that the rabbinate will, and they actually are not. Anyway, what I refer to as the second strategy is a signed bill of divorce, a get, that the husband would give the wife at some point in the marriage if he knew that he was very sick. It's called a get shchiv mirah. It was actually used in some communities, perhaps as far back as the time of the Mishnah. It's a bill of divorce that comes into effect a minute before the husband dies. The idea is that a divorced woman doesn't need chalitza, only a widow would need chalitza. Before she becomes a widow, she'll be divorced. By the way, what they're trying to do here is you can't sign the get shchiv mirah before you actually get married. So what the family would do was pressure the husband to promise that he will give her a get shchiv mirah at any point if he's very sick.
So it can be signed before he's actually sick?
It can be signed before he get married that he promises to do that. He doesn't necessarily do that
if he gets sick.
Yeah.
So the problem is also that if a person gets sick, they don't know if they're actually dying. Is that a problem?
Yes, that's a problem, because if you don't sign it, you don't.
And I would assume there are husbands that even if they promised to sign such a document, may renege on this obligation as well.
Absolutely, for sure. The last strategy, the third strategy, is the t'nai b'kiddushin. This is the best. This is a contract that the husband signs before the wedding. In it, he states that he is marrying his wife only on condition that she won't need chalitza. In other words, the husband makes the following declaration at the time of his marriage. I will marry you only on condition that I do not die without children and you do not need chalitza. In other words, the terms of the marriage are such that if the husband dies without children and his wife needs chalitza, then the marriage is null and void. If there was no marriage, there is no need for chalitza. This t'nai was used by various rabbis. It seems to be based on a statement made by the Ramah, an Ashkenazi rabbi who lived in the 16th century. The Ramah felt the need to respond to the problem of men whose brothers had left Judaism and converted to a different religion. Women didn't want to marry men whose brothers had left Jewish community and who no longer felt any commitment to the Jewish tradition. So the Ramah came up with a solution of chalitza condition that we're talking about. This marriage condition enabled women to avoid chalitza completely and enabled men whose brothers had converted to find wives. It was used again by the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Shriver, who lived in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was used just a few decades ago in Israel as well. In that particular case, the one that was used in Israel that's very much talked about lately, the brother of the groom wasn't a mumar, somebody who left Judaism. He was handicapped and didn't have the capacity to perform the ritual. And they were worried, actually, because the husband was in the army or something. So they were worried that he would.
The husband was,
happen.
I think, Kravi. He was a combat soldier.
Right. Anyway, Rav Amital from Yeshivat Har Etzion drafted a conditional marriage for the couple who wanted to get married, and he actually officiated at their wedding as well. These days, Rav Daniel Sperber also has given his okay to this type of conditional marriage. He just added on to what we have drafted in CWJ. He added on to the condition that it will only take place 6 months after the death of the husband. He didn't want the marriage to be automatically void if the husband died without any children.
So just to clarify, the document approved by Rabbi Sperber gives the brother 6 months to perform the chalitza ceremony. Only if 6 months have passed and the brother has not performed the chalitza ceremony will the marriage be declared null and void.
Right. At CWJ, we've constructed a conditional marriage contract along those lines. This contract has the approval of Rabbi Sperber. We added that the marriage doesn't become void unless the widow files with the Beit Din and specifically asks the Beit Din to declare that the conditions have come into effect. We do that because we want it to be in the hands of the woman to decide when she wants this to happen. So Rabbi Sperber said it can't happen before 6 months, and we're saying it still can't happen unless the woman wants it to happen.
And she goes to the Beit Din.
Right.
I think we also need to expand on this last point, Rivkah, on the point about the conditional marriage contracts that we drafted at CWJ. To be exact, Rivkah, we at CWJ have drafted a conditional marriage contract, which we have been promoting for years, and this contract has 2 conditions that would void a marriage. The first condition is the chalitza condition that we are talking about. So it's not only the chalitza condition. The second condition that we added to our CWJ contract would void a marriage if the couple is living apart for 18 months and the husband refuses to give a get. The first condition, the chalitza condition, addresses the problem for women of chalitza, when a woman's brother-in-law refuses or is unable to release her from the yibum tied to him. The second condition addresses the problem of the aguna, when a woman is held in marital captivity by her husband who refuses or is unable to release her from the kinyan tied to him, that is, to give her a get, a Jewish bill of divorce. But recently, you, Rivkah, recommended that we draft a more limited conditional contract, that we at CWJ come out with another contract that includes only the condition that would void a marriage in need of chalitza. Can you explain why you did this? In other words, not a contract that includes the condition that addresses the problem of the aguna.
Right. I'm looking to promote a conditional marriage only for chalitza. I did this because I think it's easier for religious couples to accept the more limited chalitza condition rather than the broader one that covers get, refusal, and aginut, the problem that arises when a husband is missing or incapacitated. And that's because when a husband is dead, there's no issue of mamzerut. So if a widow does not do chalitza at all and has not signed a conditional marriage, the children are not mamzerim, as we already discussed in the last episode. So the rabbis have less of a problem with the chalitza condition.
Yes, but let's be clear that you, me, and I think everyone else at CWJ would want our daughters who get married Kedat Moshe Yisrael, who get married in accordance with Jewish law, to sign the more comprehensive conditional marital contract that CWJ drafted, which includes the condition relating to aginut or marital captivity and get refusal.
Absolutely. We refer the listener back to our first episodes in which we explained the pitfalls of Orthodox marriage.
But here is my much bigger issue with all of this, Rivkah. I really don't understand what the women's groups are doing here. I think we should be telling women to refuse to do the chalitza ceremony, not to make it friendlier, if that is at all possible. After all, as we underscored, if women do not undergo the ritual, if they refuse to take off their brothers-in-law's shoes and spit, they can get on with their lives and live with another man, and their children will not be stigmatized, as we have already mentioned. It's true that they cannot get married in Israel, where religious rules are the law of the land. But if they want an official state recognition of their relationship, they can fly to Cyprus or somewhere else to get married civilly. The key is that there is no significant halachic consequences to them or their children if they simply ignore the obligation to undergo chalitza. So I, for one, would tell my daughter to just get on with her life rather than participate in such a humiliating ceremony, which I might add has serious patriarchal implications regarding the status of women. And here's another question that I think is of most importance. Are the women's groups asking the rabbis to inform the women of all their options? Is there informed consent? Are the rabbis telling women that there is no consequence to any children born to them if they refuse a ceremony? Or are the women's groups asking the rabbis to convince the new widows to undergo the chalitza ceremony without full disclosure of all the legal implications? To me, this is just another form of religious coercion, which services the religious community and not individual widows, especially if the women are not religious.
I agree. I'm not exactly sure what is happening inside the rabbi's chambers, but I doubt if the new widows are being told of their option to refuse to go through chalitza ceremony at all.
One more thought, Rivkah. I, for one, think a tradition cannot and should not preserve bad rules that hurt women, just for the sake of tradition, especially when that tradition has already recognized that this particular ceremony and this particular rule is bad for women. But I guess that is what this whole podcast is about. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Justice Unbound, Women, Religion, and the State of Israel, produced by the Center for Women's Justice. Today we've been talking about chalitza and how that ritual requirement impacts Israeli women whose husbands were killed in the recent war. We would love to hear your comments and thoughts. Please reach out to us on social media or on our website page.
This podcast was produced thanks to the generous support of the Gimprich Family Foundation. Thank you, Rachel Stomel, for all your help. I am Rivkah Lubitch.
And I am Susan Weiss. Thank you for listening.